Yat Abina. Good morning, my relatives. This is Mark Charles. It is Monday, September 11th, and I'm sitting down with my second cup of coffee, and I am very glad that you could be with me here today. There's a lot of things that we need to discuss. I had some travel last week. I was both in North Carolina as well as in New Mexico with my family, and had some really good events go on and some good time with my family. But I got home last Saturday, and was able to spend time with my wife and my children here in DC. And now this afternoon, I'm flying out to Montana. And over the next 2 days, on Tuesday and Wednesday, I'll be doing 4 different events up in Montana. So watch my social media. I'll be sharing those details about those events. On each day, both on Tuesday and on Wednesday, I will be speaking at colleges. This is during the day, and I'll promote where they are and their locations and times. We're just getting the clarification on that today. So we'll have all that, and I'll share that on my social media. And if you're in the area, you're welcome to come and join me. I also want to start by acknowledging that I am speaking to you from what's now called Washington, D.C., but these are the traditional lands of the Piscataway. And I want to honor the Piscataway as the hosts of the lands where I'm living. I want to thank them for their stewardship of these lands. And I want to just state how humbled I am to be living on these lands today. So there's a few things I want to just make sure that we acknowledge today, because there's a lot of stuff going on. And first of all, many of you know that there was a horrific earthquake in Morocco over the weekend. And the last numbers I heard was that 21 people, or 2,100 people, had passed away. And I'm going to share a link to that here. And you're welcome to view this. It's an article in the AP just regarding the horrors of what happened in Morocco. And obviously, we are thinking about and praying for the people of Morocco and all of those who have lost loved ones and lost their lives. And we just want to acknowledge the horror that's going on there. I also want to just remember that today is the 22nd anniversary of 9/11. And of course, that terrorist attack that happened here in the United States, and it claimed the lives of many, many people in our country. And I also want to remember just the families that are still hurting from that still have empty spaces around in their homes or around their dinner tables because of people who lost their lives in that attack. We're actually going to be talking a bit more about that in kind of a solemn way later in this cup of coffee. But I want to just start off by acknowledging that, today is the 22nd anniversary of the attack, the terrorist attack. Today, I'm very excited to introduce you to someone who is quickly becoming a very good friend of mine. I first met Murray a couple years ago, I think, and he is a Siberian Yup'ik man who is living in Alaska, and he is the pastor of a church there that is worshiping and serving indigenous peoples. And I have the chance of meeting with Murray on a regular basis. In fact, I'm flying up to Alaska in about a week and a half, or actually a week from today. I'm flying to Alaska to spend a few days with Murray, and we're going to I'll visit what he's doing at his church and just be able to spend some time with him up there. And a few weeks ago, we were talking, and he introduced me to a day of remembrance that I was not aware of. It's the day of remembrance for the disappeared. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. But let me bring Murray on, and I want to introduce you to him. On his Twitter page, he identifies himself as an anti-colonial activist pastor within the United Methodist Church. And I hadn't seen his Twitter account yet, but I love that. I love the way he describes himself there. So Murray, thanks for joining me today. Thank you for getting up a bit early in Alaska to be a part of this conversation, but it's so good to have you here.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here. And this is my first cup of coffee.
Yeah, so maybe you could just tell us a little bit about your work. I introduced the work you're doing with the church there, and I know obviously you're really trying to bring the gospel in a much more authentic way to the indigenous peoples of Alaska. I'd love if you could just tell us a little bit about the work you're doing and some of the things that you're working on right now.
You bet. So, and the part of that introduction, an anti-colonial pastor, is just by saying that an oxymoron. But it also acknowledges our reality of colonization of indigenous people here in Alaska, and how the church was the primary uh, method or the primary tool that was used for our colonization and for the travesties that occurred over the previous generations. And so our organization, we just changed our name from Every Nation United Methodist Church to Alaska Native Hope. And HOPE stands for History of Oppression, Project of Empowerment. And so we've committed ourselves for the next year to um, bringing to light the United Methodist responsibilities, United Methodist actions, and participation in the boarding school era here in Alaska, so that we can find people who have been harmed by that, um, admit that we were a part of those wrongs, to confess for our specific actions there, so that we can begin healing, because we can't really uh, do any healing until we first acknowledged that we were a part of the harm that was done. And once we do that, I think that we can start living into an authentic ministry with and for Indigenous people here in Alaska. Uh, and that if we don't acknowledge those things, that hope and that healing might never come.
Murray, we could probably spend the entire cup of coffee talking just about that and about that work, because there's so many things going on there. I'm wondering if you could just give two short, not even stories, or two short examples of what is some of the challenge in that work, and what is some of the hope or the life that's coming from that work for you that you've seen right now.
Well, that's a big old box of worms. So, the biggest challenge that we're facing right now actually is our own colonization. And so that's why I'm saying we're not decolonizing things, because we have to actively work against our ongoing colonization, um, because there are so many people throughout the state who were colonized by particular religious organizations that said, um, this is the only way. All those other people are wrong. And if you stray from what we teach you, you're going to go straight to hell. Um, and so there's that challenge in saying, well, how do we um, find an authentic faith, an authentic way of expressing ourselves spiritually that doesn't come with the fear of the colonization
Yeah.
mentality. So that's like the number one challenge that we're up against. And I'd say that the hope that we have is that um, that shared reality and our shared grief, once we acknowledge that, is going to make space for shared healing, because um, a lot of our family experiences and our understandings of things are very different and varied. But I think we have more things in common to build a solid foundation that isn't necessarily dependent on reliance on
Yeah.
future colonization.
Yeah. Well, thank you for sharing some of that. And like I said, we could go on for hours just discussing that alone, because that's, in fact, that we'll be discussing that when I'm up with you in Alaska next week.
That's right.
And so, but the reason, one of the reasons I wanted to invite you onto my second cup of coffee was a few weeks ago we were talking, and we were coming up on the end of August, and you informed me that August 30th was the International Day of Remembrance for the victims of enforced disappearances. And this is a day that is recognized much more heavily internationally, I think, than it is in the United States. And I believe you said it started in the Philippines, is one of the early places where that was first acknowledged, but it's also fairly active throughout South America and Latin America and other places like that. I have a few articles I'll share about that, but if you could just let me know, because you had some personal experience with this, or you had a much more your own story with this too. Can you let us know what is this International Day of the Victims of Enforced Disappearances?
Yes. Doing my work, I listen to Playing for Change. That's an organization that gets people all over the world to make music, and so they made a couple of songs for the International Day of the Disappeared. Um, and so one of them is a song by Natalia Lafourcade, which is called Hasta la Raíz, which means to the root. And I highly recommend anyone look up that song and bring some tissues, because it's got families coming together and talking about the family members that they've been looking for decades, and how they're still like waiting for them every day, hoping that they might find them. Like that reality struck me really hard. So I started looking into it and found out that uh, that history goes right in line with the Philippines. And my wife is from Argentina, and so we are aware of the disappeared that happened after a military coup there in the 80s in Argentina, and how to this day people are still looking for their lost children during that experience. And so while muddling through all of that, and because we are in such close proximity to uh, the National Day of Remembrance for the United States, that's federal boarding schools were genocide, and that is from boardingschoolhealing.org. Um, so that day is coming up, September the 30th. Um, and it just hit me so hard that we have so many commonalities as Indigenous people, with history of our children being stolen and sent to boarding schools, of our loved ones disappearing and dying because of active government policies that have empowered people to either not care about what the law says about harming people, or actively encourages people to do things for our own good.
Yeah.
And so when I see that, I'm like, wow, we have a lot in common with these people all over the world, of people abusing power and taking life and taking children.
Yeah.
Uh, and so that's a little bit of my personal
Yeah, well, thank you for sharing
experience.
that. I know when you first told me that, the first thing that immediately crossed my mind was the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls,
Yeah.
which is that's not as much of an issue as the state taking and causing people to disappear. The state just refusing to look for people who have disappeared. But I think the connection you made with the boarding schools and the removal of children from their homes, and the way that's happened and used as a forced assimilation and colonial tool, not just here in the US, but other places, that's a much more appropriate connection there. One of the articles I shared was from the United Nations website, and I'm going to just share this link here. Or I shared the link already, but you can see it here. I just want to read this first couple of sentences. Enforced disappearances has frequently been used as a strategy to spread terror within the society. The feeling of insecurity generated by this practice is not limited to the close relatives of the disappeared, but also affects their communities and society as a whole. Enforced disappearances has become a global problem and is not restricted to a specific region of the world. Once largely product of military dictatorships, enforced disappearances can nowadays be perpetrated in complex situations of internal conflict, especially as a means of political repression of opponents. And so, yeah, the whole point of this is just the way that this is the way that states use their forces, use their power to uh, remove people from the public view or from their families, and it causes problems. If you look at this is on Amnesty International site. I also shared this link. We're looking at different examples here. We see an example from the Republic of Congo. We see an example from Sri Lanka. And we see an example of Muslim ethnic groups in China. And so these are just some of the places where these international organizations are highlighting this is where this is taking place. So let me go ahead. I'm going to take this off the screen again. Again, I shared both of those links if you want to go back and look at them. But yeah, is there anything else? Well, let me actually go back a little bit, Murray. What can you tell us? Because I am very versed in the history of the residential schools, the boarding schools in the lower 48. Was there any sort of specific spin on it, or how was it conducted differently, or was it very much the same in Alaska? How were the boarding schools used up in the area in that region?
Well, Alaska is different. The colonization of Alaska is different from the rest of the country in that it began by dividing different regions of the state up with particular denominations. So the church denominations were the ones who were who were who were making all of this happen on behalf of the government. And so, as a United Methodist person, I've done some research and found that we had at least one United Methodist elder going out in the islands in Western Alaska and finding people who whose parents have died from a plague that had gone through there, and would find orphans, right, that were being cared for by their family, surrounded by loved ones and family, and taking them because they're technically orphans, and shipping them off to an orphanage, United Methodist orphanage run by the United Methodist women, called the Jesse Lee Home. And from there, at some point, they got overcrowded, and kids would be shipped off to Portland by boat, as far away as Carlisle, in Pennsylvania. Boarding school where many of them died and never came home. So I know that there's like currently a movement, bring our kids home, based on the actions of United Methodist clergy, which I am, and I'm doing everything I can to hold my institution accountable, because I think it's something there's something good there.
Yeah.
Behind all of that that obscured and history that's been covered over. And that's just one example. There's so many boarding schools. Last thing about Alaska, the boarding school movement was fashioned by Sheldon Jackson, who was a Presbyterian minister in my hometown of Sitka. And his work with boarding schools set the stage for the entire boarding school era. He made the model that the entire country followed. So, if there's something that we want to say originated here in Alaska, that's it.
So I want to make this conversation a lot more complex.
Okay.
And I didn't plan to have this conversation about the day they disappeared on 9/11, but that's the way it worked out with your schedule and with my schedule. And so obviously today is the day where our nation remembers all of the people who lost their lives in the terrorist attack in DC and Pennsylvania and in Washington and in New York. And we say things like, we're never going to forget, we have to remember this, so on and so forth. And both you and I know from very personal experience how much the nation wants to remember these things when the majority population has these issues. But when we talk about the history of what this nation did to African Americans or African people or Native Americans, well, that history they want to forget, right? This is where they will throw out critical race theory, and we're not going to talk about slavery in our history books, and they don't want to hear that history. And so there's very much a double standard. But as I was looking through, and this was just today regarding the what's going on the Day of Remembrance, is right. They showed Republic of Congo, they showed Sri Lanka, they showed China. They didn't show the United States. And so I actually looked on their website and I found a place where I could look at where some different injustices are happening by countries. And I looked up the United States. And as I looked down key issues, I found there was an issue under arbitrary detention. And I want to just read here 35 Muslim men remained arbitrarily and indefinitely detained in the detention facility at the U.S. Naval Base in Guantanamo Bay, Cuba, in violation of international law. The Biden administration made little progress in closing the facility despite its intention to do so. In 2022, 9 detainees held in Guantanamo Bay were approved for transfer by the Periodic Review Board, bringing to 20 the number of detainees remaining in the facility without charge after being cleared for transfer, some for over a decade. Another detainee had pleaded guilty to the charges against him and served his sentence, also remained detained. The detainees were transferred. The remaining detainees did not have access to adequate medical treatment, and survivors of torture and other ill treatment by the U.S. agents were not given adequate rehabilitation services. Now, it goes on to say the trials of those accused of crimes related to the September 9/11 attacks remained stalled. After repeated suspension in recent years, military commission prosecutors attempted to negotiate guilty plea agreements with some of those charged. So, again, what we have here, and I want to be very careful here because absolutely our nation was attacked and there needs to be justice and accountability. But because we have laws that we occasionally like to follow regarding due process and detaining people without charges and so on and so forth that apply to people who are here in the United States, we created this detention facility in Cuba and we transferred the people who we suspected of these actions and put them there. And now they're being held indefinitely without charge. They're just kind of sitting in this place of limbo. And the problem is that's not justice, right? No. And the families deserve justice, but people who are accused of crimes absolutely deserve their day in court. And this is one of the challenges we have, especially regarding 9/11, because yes, there was a horrific attack against our country, and we need to hold the people who perpetrated that attack accountable. But when we do it in ways that disregard the rule of law or disregard justice, this now becomes a massive problem. You know, one of the things I said with the Oppenheimer movie that came out and all of the discussion we've had on our development of nuclear weapons, one of the things I pointed out in my lectures is, you know, the challenge with America is we would literally rather destroy the world than lose a war, right? And so we when we feel attacked, right, we have a nuclear arsenal where we can destroy the world literally if we feel like we're going to lose a war. And the problem with that is that displays a very grotesque understanding of your own superiority, where it's almost like, well, if we can't live, then no one else deserves to live. And if we're going to lose a war, then we're just going to destroy everything. Mm-hmm. And it's the same thing. We're like, yes, it was horrific that the United States was attacked. Now, we ourselves as a nation have brutally attacked other nations in not too dissimilar ways, and yet we hold ourselves above the law. And now with the people who attacked us, we refuse to charge them, we refuse to give them a trial, and we are holding them indefinitely in this detention center in Cuba, and we don't even know how to close it, even though our leaders want to close it. They don't even know how to do it. And so this is right. So 9/11 brings up a lot of really complicated matters because, yes, it's obviously a deep day of pain for United States citizens. And I don't discount the pain that any family member any family that lost a family member in that felt, or even the sense of fear that the nation felt. But to think that we can use that as justification to throw the law out the window and then do whatever the crap we please, that is not justice either. And so 9/11 on many different levels demonstrates the double standard that the United States holds in regards to itself, both as the perpetrator of injustice as well as of the receiver of injustice.
Mm-hmm.
And we have these two double standards. Now that's my little soapbox. And do you anything you want to comment on about that, or any thoughts you have on that, even from your perspective and the work that you're doing?
My main priority is doing the best work that I can do with integrity. And it doesn't seem like our government leaders can say that they're doing that. And so like my goal is to hold the church accountable so that we can live and function and exist in the world with integrity, with justice. Full disclosure, I guess. I have family members that spent time in those boarding schools here in Alaska, and I have a lot of friends. In fact, every native Alaskan that I know has a story connected to those things. And if we don't acknowledge the harms that we've done or that are continuing to to be perpetrated, then how in the world can we live with integrity? And that's just as true with regard to the what happened at 9/11 as it is with boarding schools and other government programs of fear, annihilation, and genocide. And so, sign me up, man. How do we
and
hold people accountable?
This is the problem. When I was actually talking last week. I was in North Carolina. I spoke to probably the whitest, oldest audience I've ever spoken to. I bet it was 95% white, and 95% of the people were over the age of 65. It was the whitest, oldest group I ever spoken to. Almost 500 people were there. And I spoke directly about the doctrine of discovery, the history of the church. I talked about the dehumanizing, the genocidal legacy of Abraham Lincoln, as well as his white supremacist ways. And I didn't hold back in any regard. And I laid out a history that so many of the people there had never heard before. And one of the comments I got frequently, which I always get, right? There's this kind of this shock of like, I can't believe we did that. This is so horrible. And there was this deep wrestling of what do we do with this information and so on. And what I hear so frequently is people tell me, well, I've never heard this before, right? You're laying something out brand new. Now, my last session, after I went through the Doctrine of Discovery, I laid out my thinking that I cover in chapter 11 of my book, Unsettling Truths, about the trauma of white America and how I hypothesize that white Americans are wrestling with a multi-generational communal manifestation of a complex perpetration-induced traumatic stress, which is actually causing them to be in a state of shock and denial regarding what they perpetrated or what they're standing on. And then I told the group how I actually developed a lot of tools in creating my lectures so they wouldn't stand up and scream at me in the middle of the lectures, so I could actually get through the lecture. And I said, so maybe one of the reasons is, yes, I'm very good articulating these things. Maybe the other thing is you've actually never sat through an entire lecture before, because at best you've emotionally checked out, or at worst you've left the room in a huff, or you just didn't want to hear it anymore. And I found a way to actually get you to stay in your seat and hear the entire lecture.
Yeah.
And I think this is where, so people are like, we talk about this lack of integrity, this dual standard between the United States that we have for ourselves and that we have for people who are not white Americans. And I think the biggest challenge is, I really think because we're living in the state of shock and denial, we've never wrestled with what we're standing on as a nation. And until we can honestly wrestle with that, create that common memory, actually talk about what we've done, we're going to continue to have these double standards, to live in the state of denial, and to cry about or mourn deeply and lament and have all these other emotions regarding oppressions that we feel, but then use that as justification to turn around and do as bad or even more horrific things to people around us.
Oh yeah.
Um, and so that's, the work that I'm trying to do, the work that you're involved in, is we're trying to figure out a way is how do we get our nation, our churches, even our people, as well as the colonizers, to come together to have these types of conversations. Um, and I think that's one of the things that we have to continue to do better at. I left that conference in North Carolina convinced, even more convinced than ever, how important it is to help people understand about PITS, or the perpetration induced traumatic stress.
Yeah.
So those are some of my thoughts. Anything else you want to add here? We're about running out of time here, Murray, but I'd love if you have any other thoughts or anything else you want to bring in, even if it's completely unrelated. Um, anything else you'd like to bring in here?
You know what? Like you said, I could go on for hours on these subjects. I will say, just as a kind of a reflection on what you just shared, when I lived in South Carolina when I was 12 years old, I never in my life, and I lived a lot in the South, had I seen so many people concerned with whether you were from the North or the South. In North and South Carolina, the Civil War and the painting of it as an honorable, patriotic history is more profound than any place I've ever been. And so it wouldn't surprise me that you encountered that in North
Yeah.
Carolina because of um, how history has been sugarcoated so thoroughly and uh, throughout the the both the North
Yeah.
and the South there.
And I think one of the things that amazed me about the audience I spoke to there is how once they heard the history, they were so willing and eager to engage with it. Right, for an audience that was that white and that demographic of age group, I was blown away by their willingness to come and wrestle with the things I was laying out and deeply engage with it and try to say,
Yeah,
what do we need to do? And so that gave me a lot of hope coming out of that. And
yeah.
so,
Well,
um,
that's why we use the name for Hope History of Oppression, Project of Empowerment. If we don't address the history of oppression, how can we begin to empower each other?
yeah. Murray, is there any way people can find you on social media, or is there any way people can connect with you or the work that you're doing?
Well, I like I said, we just changed our name, and so the only existence that we have on the internet right now is facebook.com/AK Native Hope. Um, and
Okay.
you can reach us at aknativehope
I will
at
put that link in the
gmail.com.
notes for this video so people can get it there.
That's our only online presence that we have, and we're planning on getting involved with Orange Shirt Day at the end of September, and then um, when we have our church services between Columbus Day and Thanksgiving, we call that entire season anti-colonial days, where everything that we do during that time is an act of anti-colonialism or education or raising awareness of colonial history and practices that we've either been participated in or been complicit with that are affecting us during this time. And so, well, this will be our fourth year of anti-colonial days, uh, going back to our days as Every Nation UMC. And I don't know, I'm grateful that I can continue that work because
Yeah.
it's so obviously working against the system that I'm a part of.
Well, Murray, thank you so much for joining me today. Everyone, I hope your cup of coffee is as good as ours was here. Thank you for joining this conversation. Please feel free to make some comments in the chat. Please feel free to share this with friends and family. And I will be traveling this week, but hopefully, end of the week, I'll be able to come back and do another cup of coffee. And Murray, I'm looking forward to seeing you in a week. So it'll be
I
good to
know,
be out
can't
in
wait.
Alaska with you for a few days next week. So, Akiahat, my relatives, thank you for joining us. Walk in beauty, and may we all learn how to walk in beauty together. Akiahat and Hakonet.